The message arrived during breakfast, which was unfortunate timing for everyone involved. Dr. Shara-chan had been sitting on a beach in Hawaii with her toes buried in warm sand and a half-eaten mango in her hand when her emergency communicator started screaming at her. And she knew immediately that her vacation was over. The holographic display flickered to life above her wrist, showing the stern face of Commander Vexter of the Kryntian Empire. All 9 feet of scaled reptilian authority, compressed into a 6-inch projection, representative of Earth. Vexter began, his voice carrying the weight of 3,000 years of military tradition. The Galactic Coalition faces an extinction-level threat, and all member species are hereby commanded to send their highest-ranking military commanders to Aegis Prime Station within 48 standard hours. Sarah took another bite of her mango and waited for him to continue. Full ceremonial military dress is required. Vexter continued, his eyes narrowing as if he could see through the communicator to her tank top and shorts. This is not a request, and this is not optional, and failure to comply will result in immediate expulsion from the coalition. The hologram flickered off without waiting for a response, which Sarah supposed was very much in character for a species that valued authority over conversations. She looked down at her outfit, a faded blue tank top with a coffee stain on it, khaki shorts that had seen better days, and her favorite flip-flops that she'd owned since graduate school. Wow, she said to no one in particular. This should be interesting. Sarah had been Earth's liaison to the Galactic Coalition for exactly 6 months, which made her simultaneously the most experienced human in alien relations and completely unqualified for whatever military emergency was happening. And she was pretty sure the Coalition knew this humanity had only achieved faster-than-light travel 3 years ago, stumbling into a galactic community that had been running smoothly without them for millennia, and the other species seemed to view humans the way a prestigious country club might view a family that just won the lottery, technically qualified to join, but lacking in all the proper refinements. She pulled up her datapad and started making calls. General Martinez, she said when the gruff face of Earth's senior military officer appeared on screen. I need to be fitted for a dress uniform and transported to Coalition space within 6 hours. Martinez looked at her beach background and sighed the sigh. A man who had dealt with bureaucracy for 40 years, Dr. Chun. He said slowly, the nearest military base to your location is Pearl Harbor, which is 3 hours away by conventional transport, and getting you fitted for proper ceremonial dress would take another 8 hours minimum, and the nearest coalition transport that can get you to Aegis Prime in time leaves from the civilian port in 2 hours. Sarah did the math in her head, which didn't take long because the math was depressing. So what you're saying is, what I'm saying is you need to get on that civilian transport in whatever you're wearing right now, or Earth doesn't get a representative at this war council. Martinez interrupted, his expression suggesting he found this situation exactly as ridiculous as she did. Sarah looked down at her flip-flops again. The coalition is going to love this, she muttered. She packed quickly, throwing her datapad and a change of clothes into a small bag, though she suspected the change of clothes wouldn't matter much at this point. And she made one more call before leaving. Professor Ito answered on the 3rd ring, his elderly face creasing into a smile. Sarah, he exclaimed, how is the vacation going? It's ending early, Sarah said, jogging toward the transport station. Professor, I need you to send me everything you have on human military history. And I mean everything. Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, guerrilla warfare tactics, asymmetric warfare, psychological operations. All of it. Professor Ito's smile faded into confusion. Sarah, you're a Zen anthropologist, not a military strategist. So why? Because the coalition just called a war council, and I'm apparently Earth's representative, Sarah said, and I have a feeling they're going to expect me to know what I'm talking about. I see. Professor Ito said thoughtfully, I'll send everything immediately, but Sarah, most of human military history involves tactics that other species might consider, shall we say, less than honorable? Good, Sarah said. Send those especially. The civilian transport to Coalition space was a converted cargo hauler that had been retrofitted for passenger use, which meant the seats were uncomfortable and the air recycling system made everything smell faintly of engine coolant. But it would get her to Aegis Prime with 3 hours to spare. The other passengers were mostly merchants and traders, humans, and aliens mixing in the casual way that happened in neutral space. And none of them paid much attention to the woman in flip-flops reading military strategy papers on her datapad. Sarah spent the 12-hour journey absorbing everything Professor Withdrew had sent, her academic mind cataloging patterns and strategies that humanity had developed over 10,000 years of warfare. What struck her most was how different human warfare was from everything she'd learned about Coalition military doctrine. The Coalition species fought with honor, with rigid formations and predetermined battle protocols that had been refined over 3 millennia, and they valued direct confrontation and formal declarations and following the rules even when losing humans. Sarah realized had never fought that way. Humans came from Earth, which the Coalition had classified as a Class 12 death world. After their first survey team nearly got eaten by what they thought was a small herbivore. And on a death world, you didn't survive by being honorable. You survived by being smart, by being adaptable, by using every advantage you could find and inventing new ones when necessary. The Coalition had evolved warfare as a sport, Sarah thought, but humans had evolved warfare as survival when the transport docked at Aegis Prime. Sarah gathered her small bag and stepped into the docking corridor, and immediately understood that she had made a terrible fashion decision. The corridor was filled with representatives from other Coalition species, and every single one of them was dressed in elaborate military regalia that probably cost more than Sarah's entire education. They were Corinthians in scaled armor that gleamed under the station lights, and Heliori in flowing combat silks that seemed to move on their own, and Vex Corians in exoskeletons that made them look like walking fortresses. And then there was Sarah, in her tank top and shorts and flip-flops, carrying a datapad and looking like she'd just wandered in from a beach party. The other representatives stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to outright horror. A Corinthian officer approached her, his scaled face twisted in disgust. "You are the human representative?" he asked, his translator making his voice sound appropriately appalled. "Dr. Sarah Chen," she confirmed, holding out her hand in the human gesture of greeting that most Coalition species had learned to tolerate. The Corinthian looked at her hand like it might bite him. "You will report to the War Council immediately," he said, turning away without taking her hand. "Commander Vexter is most eager to meet you." Sarah followed him through the corridors of Aegis Prime, her flip-flops making soft slapping sounds against the metal floor that echoed embarrassingly in the formal silence. And she could feel every eye in the station tracking her progress. The War Council chamber was enormous, a circular room with a massive holographic display in the center and tiered seating arranged around it like an ancient amphitheater. And standing at attention around the display were the military commanders of 12 different species. They all turned to look when Sarah entered, and the chamber fell into a silence so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat. Commander Vexter stood at the head of the council, his 9-foot frame radiating authority and barely contained fury. He looked at Sarah for a long moment, his reptilian eyes taking in every detail of her inappropriate attire. And when he finally spoke, his voice was cold enough to freeze hydrogen. "Earth," he said slowly, "has sent us a civilian in beach clothes to a War Council." Sarah met his gaze and didn't look away. "Earth," she replied calmly, "sent the person you asked for within the time frame you specified. So if you wanted someone different, then perhaps you should have given more notice." The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs, because apparently no one spoke to Commander Vexter that way. and lived to tell about it, but Sarah had read enough human military history to know one fundamental truth. Respect wasn't given to those who looked the part. It was earned by those who did the job, and she was about to show the Galactic Coalition what a human could do when properly motivated, even if she was wearing flip-flops while doing it. The silence that followed Sarah's response stretched until it became almost physical. Pressing down on the War Council chamber like a weight commander Vexthur scaled, face shifted through several colors that Sarah's translator helpfully informed her indicated rising anger, confusion, and grudging surprise in that order. "You dare to speak to me with such disrespect?" Vexthur demanded, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. Sarah adjusted the strap of her tank top and shrugged. "I wasn't aware that stating facts counted as disrespect," she said evenly. "You sent an emergency summons with a 48-hour deadline. I arrived within that deadline. So technically, I've exceeded your requirements by 3 hours. 3 hours. Technically, I've exceeded your requirements by 3 hours." Small alien that looked like a floating jellyfish made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it cut off quickly when Vexthur turned his glare in that direction. "The Galactic Coalition," Vexthur said slowly, as if explaining something to a particularly stupid child, "is facing an existential threat from the Void Swarm, a hive mind species that has destroyed 3 entire star systems in the past 2 months. And you arrived dressed as if you were attending a recreational gathering?" "I arrived dressed as if I was on vacation when you called," Sarah corrected. "Which I was, and I'm happy to discuss the Void Swarm situation, which I assume is why you called this council. But first, I'd like to understand why we're spending time discussing my clothing instead of discussing how to not get eaten by a hive mind." Several of the other commanders shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah realized that perhaps directness was not a valued trait in Coalition military culture of X. Sir Scales rippled in a way that suggested he was making a decision. "Very well," he said finally. "Since you were so eager to discuss strategy, let us review the battle plans. And then perhaps you will understand why we value proper military discipline and appearance." He gestured to the holographic display, which lit up with a 3-dimensional map of the star system. "The Void Swarm operates as a single coordinated organism," Vexthur explained, his voice taking on the tone of a lecturer, "with millions of individual units acting in perfect synchronization. And they have proven resistant to all conventional weapons when encountered in sufficient numbers." The hologram showed previous battles, with coalition fleets engaging swarms of dark shapes that moved like schools of fish, flowing around obstacles and overwhelming defensive positions through sheer numbers. "Our strategy," Vexthur continued, "is to assemble the largest military force in Coalition history and engage the swarm in a decisive battle at the Meridian Gate, where the narrow hyperspace corridors will prevent them from using their numerical advantage." He highlighted a location on the map where several hyperspace lanes converged. "We will position our forces in a traditional defensive formation," he said, "with heavy cruisers at the front, support vessels in the middle, and command ships at the rear. And when the swarm emerges, we will engage them with overwhelming firepower until they are destroyed or forced to retreat." Sarah studied the hologram for 30 seconds, her academic mind automatically cataloging everything she was seeing and comparing it to the military history. She'd spent 12 hours reading. "May I ask a question?" she said. Quiet Livexter gestured magnanimously, clearly expecting her to praise his brilliant strategy. "How many times has this strategy worked against the Void Swarm?" Sarah asked. "This will be the first deployment of this particular formation," Vexthur admitted. "But it is based on tactics that have proven successful for the Coalition for over 3,000 years, against species that follow Coalition military conventions," Sarah said. "And it wasn't a question. All intelligent species understand the value of honorable warfare," Vexthur replied stiffly. Sarah pulled up her datapad and started making notes. Okay, she said. So looking at your previous engagements with the swarm, they've adapted to every conventional tactic you've used within minutes of first contact. Is that correct? They are a hive mind, one of the other commanders spoke up. A crystalline being that chimed when it talked. They share information instantaneously across all units. Right, Sarah said. So they learn from every encounter and share that knowledge immediately. Which means using the same tactics repeatedly is probably not going to work. Which is why we are using an overwhelming force this time. Vexter said impatiently, but you're still using a predictable formation. Sarah pointed out, heavy ships in front, support in the middle, command in the back. Which is exactly what the swarm will expect because it's what you always do. The chamber erupted in indignant murmurs. Are you suggesting? A Heliori commander said coldly. That 3,000 years of proven military doctrine is somehow flawed. I'm suggesting, Sarah said carefully, that doctrine designed for fighting honorable opponents might not work against an enemy that doesn't care about honor. Vexter leaned forward, his claws clicking against the console. And I suppose you have a better strategy? He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Sarah looked up from her datapad. Maybe, she said. But I'd need to study the swarm's behavior patterns more carefully first. And I'd need access to your combat records and sensor data from all previous engagements. Absolutely not, Vexter said flatly. I will not entrust classified military data to a civilian who arrived at a war council wearing footwear designed for beaches. Sarah felt her patience, which had been wearing thin. Finally, snap, Commander, she said, her voice sharper now. You demanded that Earth send someone to prepare for war. And I'm here, and I'm offering to help. But if you're more interested in judging my clothing than accepting assistance, then maybe you should have been more specific about what you actually wanted. The chamber fell silent again. But this time, the quality of the silence was different. Charged with tension and surprise, Vexter studied her for a long moment, his eyes calculating. You truly believe you can devise a superior strategy? He asked. I believe, Sarah said, that I can offer a different perspective. One based on 10,000 years of human military experience, which apparently involves tactics and strategies that the Coalition has never considered, because you come from a death world, Vexter said. And there was something new in his voice now. Something that might have been curiosity, because we come from a planet where you fight to survive. Not to prove your honor, Sarah corrected. And that tends to make you creative about warfare. Vexter made a decision. Very well, he said. I will give you 24 hours to present an alternative strategy, and you will have access to all combat records and sensor data. And if your plan is superior, then I will personally consider implementing it. And if it's not? Sarah asked, then Earth will be expelled from this council and left to face the Void Swarm alone when they reach your territory. Vexter said simply, which our projections suggest will happen within 6 months. Sarah nodded slowly. That seems fair, she said. Though I have one question before I start. What is it? Where can I get coffee on this station? Sarah asked, because I'm going to need a lot of it. For the first time since she'd entered the chamber. Vexter's expression shifted into something that might have been amusement. I will have some sent to the archives, he said. Where you will be working, and Dr. Chun, yes? For what it is worth, Vexter said quietly. I hope you prove me wrong about humans. Sarah picked up her datapad and headed for the door, her flip-flops slapping against the floor. Commander, she called back over her shoulder. Where I come from, hope is what you have before the battle starts. And planning is what keeps you alive during it. So let's focus on the planning part and see what happens. She left the chamber with 12 pairs of eyes watching her go. And she suspected that at least half of them were hoping she would fail. That was fine. Sarah thought she'd spent her entire academic career proving people wrong about their assumptions. This was just going to be a slightly higher stakes version of peer review, even if she was conducting it while wearing flip-flops. The archives of Aegis Prime were located deep in the station's core. A vast circular room filled with holographic displays and data terminals that hummed with the accumulated military knowledge of 12 species across 3,000 years. Sarah claimed a corner workstation, kicked off her flip-flops, and propped her feet up on the desk in a way that would have horrified every military commander in the coalition. The coffee arrived 10 minutes later, delivered by a nervous-looking Corinthian ensign who stared at her bare feet with obvious confusion before retreating quickly. "Okay," Sarah muttered to herself, pulling up the first batch of combat records. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The Void Swarm's first recorded appearance had been 6 months ago, when an entire mining colony had gone silent and investigation teams found nothing but empty buildings and stripped infrastructure. And the attacks had been escalating ever since Sarah watched the sensor recordings from various encounters. Her academic mind cataloging patterns, the swarm moved like a liquid, flowing around obstacles and converging on targets from multiple directions simultaneously. And individual units were relatively fragile, but they operated in such overwhelming numbers that conventional weapons couldn't kill them fast enough when coalition forces tried to establish defensive perimeters. The swarm would probe for weaknesses until they found one, and then pour through the gap like water through a cracked dam when coalition forces tried offensive strikes. The swarm would scatter and reform somewhere else, making it impossible to achieve a decisive victory. The coalition had tried everything in their tactical playbook: concentrated firepower, distributed formations, technological superiority, superior positioning, and nothing had worked for more than a few minutes. Before the swarm adapted, Sarah leaned back in her chair and thought about what Professor Itu had taught her about military anthropology. Every species fights the way their evolution taught them to survive, he'd said during one of her graduate seminars. And you can predict their tactics by understanding their history. The coalition species had all evolved on relatively gentle worlds, where resources were abundant and conflicts were settled through ritualized combat. So their warfare had become formalized, with rules and protocols that everyone followed because breaking them was considered worse than losing humans. Had evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill them. Earth had predators that could tear through metal, weather patterns that could flatten cities, diseases that could wipe out populations. And humans had survived not by being the strongest or the fastest, but by being clever enough to turn every disadvantage into an advantage. Sarah pulled up Sun Tzu's The Art of War and started reading. All warfare is based on deception, the ancient text declared. And Sarah smiled because she suspected that sentence alone would horrify the coalition commanders. She spent the next 6 hours diving deep into human military history, from ancient times to modern warfare, and a pattern emerged that was so obvious she wondered why she hadn't seen it. Immediately, humans didn't fight fair when Hannibal faced superior Roman forces. He'd used elephants and terrain to his advantage, attacking from directions the Romans thought impossible. When guerrilla fighters faced overwhelming military might, they'd refuse to engage on the enemy's terms, instead using hit-and-run tactics and blending into civilian populations. When the Mongols conquered half the world, they'd use speed and deception, pretending to retreat and then ambushing pursuers. When modern military forces faced insurgencies, the side with fewer resources and worse technology often won because they understood that victory wasn't about winning battles, but about making the enemy give up. Sarah started making notes, her fingers flying across her datapad. Coalition kept trying to beat the swarm at their own game, using superior numbers against superior numbers. But the swarm would always have more numbers because they were a hive mind that could reproduce faster than any conventional military cell. Don't fight numbers with numbers. Sarah thought, fight numbers with psychology. The swarm was a hive mind, which meant they thought as one organism, which meant they had all the advantages of coordination, but also all the disadvantages of singular thinking if you confuse the mind. You confuse the entire swarm. Sarah pulled up the sensor data again and started analyzing the swarm's decision-making patterns, looking for the logic behind their movements. And she found it after 2 hours of careful study. The swarm always moved toward the largest concentration of resources. And they always prioritized targets based on a predictable algorithm that favored energy sources and manufacturing capability. They were efficient. Sarah realized, brutally efficient. And that efficiency was both their greatest strength and their most exploitable weakness. She drafted her first strategic proposal. Use false targets to manipulate the swarm's movement. If the coalition created fake energy signatures and false supply depots, they could draw the swarm exactly where they wanted them, and then hit them when they were scattered and vulnerable. But that was just the beginning. Sarah dove into psychological warfare next, studying how humans had used propaganda, misinformation, and fear to break enemy morale throughout history. And she wondered if a hive mind could experience confusion. The combat records suggested yes in one engagement. The swarm had briefly faltered when coalition forces had broadcast contradictory sensor data, almost as if the hive mind had trouble processing conflicting information. Sarah made more notes. Broadcast false tactical data. Create sensor ghosts. Make the swarm question what they're seeing. Then she studied asymmetric warfare, the tactics that weaker forces used against stronger ones. And she realized that the coalition had never considered themselves the weaker force before. They had the best technology, the most powerful ships, the most experienced commanders. So why would they use tactics designed for underdogs? Because the swarm doesn't care about your advantages, Sarah thought. They just care about consuming you. She outlined guerrilla tactics adapted for space warfare. Never engage in prolonged combat. Hit hard and retreat before the swarm can adapt. Target their logistics instead of their warriors. Make every engagement unpredictable by hour 12. Sarah had consumed 6 cups of coffee and filled her datapad with dozens of tactical proposals. And she started synthesizing them into a coherent strategy. The key was layers of deception. First layer, false targets to manipulate. Swarm movement and make them divide their forces. Second layer, psychological warfare to disrupt hive mind. Coordination. Third layer, guerrilla tactics to prevent adaptation. Fourth layer, targeting logistics instead of warriors to slowly degrade their capability. And the final layer, never ever do what the enemy expects. Sarah drafted her presentation, keeping it simple because she knew the coalition commanders would be looking for reasons to reject it when she finally looked up from her work. 23 hours had passed, and she felt like her brain had been squeezed through a processing unit, but she had a strategy. One based on 10,000 years of human experience fighting enemies that were bigger, stronger, and more numerous than them. The question now was whether the coalition would accept it. Sarah saved her work, slipped her flip-flops back on, and headed back to the War Council chamber. The commanders were already assembled when she arrived, looking like they'd spent the night in those elaborate uniforms, which they probably had because Sarah suspected that coalition military culture didn't allow for casual clothing even during sleepvex. Thor gestured to the central holographic display. "Dr. Chun," he said formally, "you have had 24 hours to study the Void Swarm and devise an alternative strategy, and the Council is prepared to hear your presentation." Sarah uploaded her data to the display and took a deep breath. "Before I begin," she said, I need everyone here to understand that what I'm about to propose will violate pretty much every rule of warfare that the Coalition has established over 3,000 years. The commanders stirred uneasily. I will recommend deception, false retreats, attacking non-military targets, refusing honorable combat, using psychological warfare, and generally doing everything that your cultures probably consider cowardly or dishonorable. Then why should we listen? Demanded the Heliori commander. Sarah met his gaze. Because honor won't matter if you're all dead, she said flatly. And the swarm doesn't care about your rules or your traditions or your pride. So you can either win dishonorably and survive, or lose honorably and become extinct. And I know which one I'd choose. She pulled up the first part of her strategy. Here's what I propose, she began. And the chamber fell silent as she walked them through a type of warfare they'd never imagined. Type of warfare that humans had perfected over millennia, type of warfare that might just save the galaxy even if it destroyed the Coalition's sense of honor in the process. Commander Vex there listened to Sarah's entire presentation in complete silence, his scaled face unreadable as she outlined tactics that violated every principle of honorable warfare the Coalition had ever established. When she finished, the chamber erupted in outraged voices. "This is barbarism," shouted the crystalline commander, its chiming voice sharp with disgust. "You propose we lie to our enemy?" demanded a Vex Corian officer, his exoskeleton clanking as he stood in protest. "False retreats? Attacking supply lines? Broadcasting fake distress signals?" The Heliori commander's flowing combat silks rippled with his agitation. "These tactics are beneath us." Sarah stood quietly at the center of the storm, waiting for the noise to die down. And when it finally did, Vexter spoke. "Your strategy," he said slowly, "assumes that survival is more important than honor." "Yes," Sarah said simply. "And you believe that our 3,000-year military tradition is fundamentally flawed?" "I believe it's fundamentally designed for fighting enemies who share your values," Sarah corrected. "And the Void Swarm doesn't share anything except hunger." Vexter was silent for a long moment, his claws tapping rhythmically against his command console. "I propose a test," he said finally. The chamber quieted instantly. "We will conduct war games," Vexter continued, "using the Coalition's new battle simulation system that can accurately model Void Swarm behavior. And Dr. Chen will command one fleet using her human tactics, while I command an equal fleet using traditional Coalition strategy." He turned to face Sarah directly. "If your tactics prove superior in simulation," he said, "then I will seriously consider implementing them in actual combat. But if they fail, then Earth will be expelled from this council immediately, and you will return home to await the swarm's arrival at your borders." "That seems fair," Sarah said, though internally she was calculating the odds of success, and not liking what she found. "The simulation will begin in 4 hours," Vexter announced, "which should give you enough time to rest and prepare." Sarah laughed, a short bark of sound that made several commanders flinch. "Commander," she said, "I just spent 24 hours straight planning this strategy, so 4 more hours won't make much difference. But I appreciate the gesture. Then we begin immediately." Vexter decided the war games took place in Aegis Prime's central simulation chamber, a massive spherical room where holographic projections created a 3-dimensional battlefield that looked and felt real enough to trick the senses. Sarah stood at her command console, still wearing her tank top and flip-flops, while around her gathered the 12 species representatives who had come to watch the human fail. Vex there stood at the opposite side of the chamber at his own console, surrounded by his most trusted advisors. The simulation coordinator, a floating jellyfish-like alien, explained the parameters. "Each commander has been given 20 ships of mixed capabilities," it announced. and the simulation will pit both fleets against an equal-sized void swarm force with behavior patterns based on actual combat data. The holographic battlefield materialized between them, showing a star system with several planets and a nearby nebula. The objective is simple, the coordinator continued. Eliminate or rout the swarm with minimal casualties, and the simulation will run until one fleet achieves victory or both fleets are destroyed. Ladies and gentlemen, it chimed. Begin. Vexthor's fleet immediately moved into a traditional formation, heavy cruisers advancing in a wall, support vessels behind them providing cover fire, command ships safely in the rear, coordinating everything. It was textbook coalition tactics. Refined over millennia, Sarah looked at her own fleet and smiled. All ships, she said into her com. Scatter formation, make it look panicked, and start broadcasting fake distress signals. Her fleet broke apart like a school of fish startled by a predator. Ships peeling off in different directions and sending out emergency calls for help to swarm. Detecting what appeared to be prey in disarray, immediately split up to pursue the scattered ships. Vexthor's fleet engaged the swarm units that came toward them with disciplined precision. Heavy weapons cutting through individual swarm entities efficiently, but the swarm kept coming, wave after wave. And slowly Vexthor's formation began taking damage. Meanwhile, Sarah's fleeing ships were leading there. Swarm pursuers on a chase through the nebula where sensor readings were unreliable. Now, Sarah said quietly, hidden ships that had been powered down and drifting like debris suddenly activated, emerging from the nebula's interference to catch the pursuing swarm units in a crossfire. The swarm units died quickly, caught between the ambush and the ships they'd been chasing. But the swarm was a hive mind, and it learned immediately. The remaining units abandoned their pursuit and began regrouping, forming a coordinated mass that could defend against ambush. Sarah watched them consolidate and nodded. Phase 2, she ordered. Broadcast fake targeting data. Make it look like we're massing for an attack on their left flank. Her ships repositioned, creating sensor signatures that suggested a major offensive was coming from one direction, the swarm. Having learned to counter her ambush tactics, moved to defend that flank. Sarah's actual attack came from above and below simultaneously, hitting the swarm where they'd left themselves exposed while defending against the fake threat across the battlefield. Vexthor's traditional strategy was grinding down the swarm through sheer firepower, but his fleet was taking heavy casualties, and the swarm was adapting to his predictable formations. They're learning our firing patterns, one of Vexthor's advisors reported, and Sarah could hear the worry in his voice. Maintain formation, Vexthor ordered, and increase firepower concentration. It was the right tactical decision given coalition doctrine. But Sarah could see it wouldn't be enough. The swarm was already adjusting, flowing around the heaviest fire like water around rocks. Sarah pulled up her tactical map and made a decision that would either cement her credibility or destroy it completely. All ships, she commanded, broadcast emergency evacuation signals and fake reactor meltdown warnings. Then execute a full retreat toward the nebula. Her fleet began fleeing again. This time, with every ship screaming that they were about to explode, the swarm, sensing an opportunity to eliminate weakened prey, pursued eagerly. Sarah watched them come, counting seconds in her head. Now drop the mines we planted in the nebula during Phase 1, she said. The nebula lit up as dozens of hidden explosive devices detonated simultaneously, catching the pursuing swarm in a killing zone they hadn't known existed. Swarm's hive mind reeled from the coordinated destruction, and in that moment of confusion, Sarah's fleet turned and attacked with everything they had within minutes. Her section of the battlefield was clear. Vexthor's fleet was still locked in grinding attrition warfare with his portion of the swarm. Ships dying on both sides as the battle continued. Sarah pulled up her communications to Vexthor commander. She said, Request permission to support your position. There was a long pause before Vexter responded. Permission granted, he said stiffly. Sarah's fleet hit the swarm, engaging Vexter from an unexpected angle, using hit-and-run tactics to confuse and fragment the hive mind's coordination. And within 20 minutes, the simulation ended. The holographic battlefield faded, revealing the stark reality of the results. Sarah's fleet had achieved a 4-to-1 kill ratio with only 2 ships damaged. Vex, Thor's fleet had won their section, but had lost 8 ships with 5 more critically damaged. The chamber was absolutely silent. Vexter stared at the casualty reports for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. It appears, he said slowly, that unorthodox tactics have certain advantages. They're only unorthodox if you think war is about honor. Sarah replied quietly. Where I come from, war is about protecting the people who can't protect themselves. And you do that by winning, not by fighting fairly. The other commanders murmured among themselves, some in shock, some in grudging respect, and some in outright horror at what they'd just witnessed. Vexter walked across the chamber until he stood directly in front of Sarah, towering over her by several feet. Dr. Chun, he said formally, you have proven that humanity understands warfare in ways we have forgotten or never learned, and I withdraw my objection to your participation in this council. He paused, and something shifted in his expression. In fact, he continued, I believe you should. The chamber's emergency alert system screamed to life. Interrupting whatever Vexter had been about to say, the floating coordinator appeared, its usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious panic. Commander, it cried, we've just received a distress signal from the Helian colonies, and the Void Swarm is attacking in force, and they'll reach Helian 4 within 18 hours. The chamber erupted in urgent voices as commanders rushed to their consoles. Vex to look down at Sarah, still in her flip-flops, still looking like she'd wandered in from vacation. Dr. Chun, he said, how would you like to test your theories in actual combat? Sarah thought about the 2 million civilians on Helian 4 who were about to be consumed by a hive mind that didn't understand. Mercy, I'd like a fleet and a crew that will follow orders without questioning them, she said. Done, Vexter said immediately. You'll have command of the defense fleet, and Dr. Chun? Yes, try not to get us all killed. Sarah smiled grimly. The defense fleet assembled around Sarah's new flagship, a Corinthian heavy cruiser called the Absolute Valor, and she stood on the bridge watching 12 ships from 8 different species fall into formation. None of them looked happy about taking orders from the human in flip-flops. All ships report ready, her communications officer announced. A Heliori named Syrah, who had made it very clear she considered this assignment beneath her dignity. Time to swarm arrival at Helian 4? Sarah asked. 17 hours and 40 minutes. Syrah replied. Sarah pulled up the tactical display showing Helian 4, a colony world with 2 million civilians who were currently in the process of panicking as evacuation alerts screamed across every communication channel. Open a fleet-wide channel, Sarah ordered. The bridge fell silent as every ship in the fleet tuned in to hear their new commander's first address. This is Dr. Sarah Chun, she began, keeping her voice calm and professional. And I know most of you don't want to be here taking orders from a civilian. And I know you think my tactics are dishonorable or cowardly or whatever your culture's word is for fighting smart, instead of fighting fair. She paused, letting that sink in. But here's the truth, she continued. In 17 hours, the Void Swarm is going to reach Helian 4, where 2 million people are waiting to be saved. And those people don't care about honor or tradition, or whether we follow proper military protocol. They just care about surviving. Sarah pulled up images of the Helian colonies, showing cities full of families and children. You can hate me for my tactics, she said quietly, You can file complaints about my clothing, and you can question my authority. But if you want those 2 million people to live through tomorrow, then you will follow my orders exactly as I give them, and you will do it without hesitation. And you will trust that I know what I'm doing." She let the silence stretch for a moment. "If anyone can accept that," Sarah finished, "then transfer to a different ship now, because I will not have time to argue with you when the swarm arrives." "No one transferred." "Good," Sarah said. "Then let's get to work." She spent the next 12 hours transforming her fleet from a conventional military force into something the Void Swarm had never encountered before. First, she scattered her ships across the Helion system in positions that violated every rule of defensive formations, placing them near asteroid fields, inside planetary rings, and hiding in the shadows of moons. And she began the evacuation. But not in the orderly military fashion the Coalition preferred. "I want it to look chaotic," Sarah explained to her confused logistics officer. "I want the swarm to see refugees fleeing in panic, transport ships colliding with each other, communications breaking down. But that will cause actual panic." The officer protested. "The civilians are already panicking," Sarah pointed out. "We're just going to make it look worse than it is. And every transport that accidentally breaks formation is actually moving toward a safe hyperspace corridor that the swarm doesn't know exists." She programmed fake energy signatures to make it appear that civilians were sheltering in obvious locations, like underground bunkers and sealed buildings. "The swarm will go for those signatures first," Sarah explained. "But the buildings will be empty, except for sensor drones that will broadcast more fake signals when the swarm arrives." Her crew began to understand what she was doing, creating a battlefield where nothing was what it seemed. The Void Swarm arrived exactly on schedule, emerging from hyperspace as a writhing cloud of dark shapes that immediately began flowing toward Helion Ivy. Sarah watched them come and smiled. "All ships hold position," she ordered, "and maintain communication silence. They'll detect us eventually," Sarah warned. "Yes," Sarah agreed. But not yet. The swarm descended on the planet, splitting into smaller groups to pursue the energy signatures that suggested easy prey. They found empty buildings and sensor drones. The hive mind paused, confused by the lack of actual targets, and in that moment of confusion, Sarah struck. "All ships attack," she commanded. "Hit the closest swarm cluster with everything you have, and then retreat before they can coordinate a response." Her scattered fleet emerged from hiding and unleashed concentrated fire on isolated swarm groups, destroying thousands of units in seconds before vanishing back into the asteroids and planetary rings. The swarm tried to regroup, tried to coordinate a defense, but Sarah's ships were already gone. "Phase 2, Sarah announced. "Broadcast a fake supply depot signal." She'd programmed the location in the outer system to emit massive energy readings that suggested a critical military supply station. The swarm, following their predictable algorithm, sent a large force to investigate and destroy it. The supply station was actually an asteroid field full of mines. The swarm force flew directly into the trap and was obliterated. "They're learning," Sarah's tactical officer reported as the swarm began ignoring obvious traps. "Good," Sarah said. "Now we use that against them." She began broadcasting signals that were obviously fake. So obviously fake that the swarm would ignore them, and hidden within those fake signals were real communications coordinating her fleet's actual movements. The swarm couldn't tell the difference between deception designed to be obvious and deception designed to be subtle. For 6 hours, Sarah danced her fleet through the Helion system, hitting the swarm from unexpected angles, using tactics that changed every few minutes so the hive mind could never adapt. Her ships took damage and she lost fighters, but the casualties were minimal compared to what traditional tactics would have cost. Then The swarm tried something new. A massive force broke off from the main group and made directly for Sarah's flagship, apparently having identified her as the source of coordination. They're adapting faster than predicted, Sarah said nervously as proximity alerts screamed. Traditional doctrine said the commander should retreat to safety. Sarah had read enough military history to know that sometimes the most unpredictable thing you could do was exactly what the enemy didn't expect. All ships converge on my position, she ordered, and prepare for close combat. That's suicide. Sarah protested. No, Sarah said calmly. That's the swarm thinking it's suicide, which means they'll either hesitate or commit too heavily. And either way we win. She turned the absolute valor directly toward the oncoming swarm and accelerated. The swarm hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, their hive mind trying to determine if this was a trap or genuine recklessness. 2 seconds was enough. Sarah's fleet converged from all directions, catching the swarm force in a perfect sphere of coordinated fire with no escape routes. The swarm units died by the thousands. The main swarm force is breaking off, her sensor officer reported in amazement. They're retreating. Sarah checked her tactical display and confirmed it. The hive mind had calculated that it couldn't win against an opponent this unpredictable, and it was withdrawing to preserve its remaining forces. Let them go, Sarah ordered. Our job was to protect Helion 4, not to chase them across the galaxy. The bridge crew stared at her. We won? Sarah asked in disbelief. We won, Sarah confirmed. And we did it with less than 8% casualties. The fleet erupted in cheers. 3 days later, Sarah stood once again in the War Council chamber on Aegis Prime. And this time, when she entered in her tank top and flip-flops, no one stared in disgust. They stared in respect. Commander Vexter waited at the center of the chamber, and the 12 species representatives stood in formal attention around him. Dr. Sarah Chun, Vexter announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. For 3,000 years, the Galactic Coalition has defined warfare through tradition and honor and rigid adherence to established doctrine. He walked toward her slowly. We forgot, he continued, that the purpose of warfare is not to prove our honor, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And we forgot that sometimes the greatest warriors are those who never wanted to be warriors at all. Vex. Thor reached up and removed something from his chest. A badge made of strange metal that seemed to shift colors in the light. This is the Supreme Commander's badge, he said. Worn by the Coalition's finest military leader for the past 3 centuries. And I have worn it for 40 years. The chamber held its collective breath. But I'm not the finest military leader in this room, Vexter said quietly. He stepped forward and pinned the badge to Sarah's tank top. Right next to the coffee stain, Dr. Chun, he announced. By the authority granted to me by the Galactic Coalition, I name you Supreme Commander of Coalition Forces. And may you teach us to fight not with honor, but with wisdom. Sarah looked down at the badge on her casual clothing and felt the weight of 2 million saved lives and an entire fleet that had trusted her despite their doubts. I accept, she said. On one condition. Name it, Vexter said. The Coalition starts learning from every member species' military history. Not just your own traditions, Sarah said. Because Earth has 10,000 years of warfare to share. But I guarantee every other species in this room has unique perspectives that could save lives if we just listen to them. She looked around the chamber, and more importantly, she continued, we need to remember that being prepared for war is important, but being prepared for peace is better. So maybe once we deal with the Void Swarm, we should focus on making sure we never need these tactics again. Vexter's scaled face shifted into what might have been a smile.